Hello, my name is Crystal Gonzales, and I am the Executive Director of the English Learner Success Forum.
Hi, I'm Jack Dieckmann. I'm the Senior Advisor for Mathematics for the English Learner Success Forum.
Hello, and welcome to our session. And we'll be talking with you today about amplifying language in secondary mathematics. Please remember to download our handouts from the resource space on this website. And following our presentation, we'll be responding to your questions in the chat space for the live Q&A. So let's get started. So for today's agenda, we're going to be tackling three things. One, understand the needs of multilingual learners and their teachers in secondary mathematics education. Secondly, we'll learn about the research base in amplifying language in mathematics and what this looks like in materials, something very concrete about what we're talking about. And lastly, we'll learn about a district that has incorporated these best practices into their math material selection process. So for today, we want to clarify the term that we will be using throughout the presentation, and that is multilingual learners. As you know, there's various terms that are being used across the country. We have English learners, English language learners, emergent bilinguals, and just clarifying that most of the time I'll be using the term multilingual learner, or MLL, as I believe it's more assets-based than the term ELL. And here we have proficiency rates. We want to start off with a little bit about the issue and the problem. And so as you look at the proficiency rates from the 2022 National Assessment of Educational Programs, here we'll see that the nation's schools are preparing less than 1 in 10 multilingual learners to be proficient in science, math, or reading. Again, less than 1 in 10. And we know our multilingual learners deserve a lot more. These academic outcomes indicate that students are not being provided access to rigorous math and science coursework. As we think about amplifying language in mathematics, we decided to focus on something concrete today. Materials are part of our everyday work with students. With multilingual learners being the fastest growing student population in our school system, there is no reason our materials should not be inclusive of their needs and responsive to their cultural assets, even at the secondary level. In places like California, multilingual learners make up nearly 20% of the student population, and about 40% ever English learners. Inclusive materials should not be an exception, but the norm. And we have decades of research that show that English learners or multilingual learners need in content learning. So ultimately, equal access to content instruction is the foundation of educational equity, and materials should be a lever for equity. Unfortunately, we know that access to materials is a big gap in our system. In the summer of 2021, the English Learner Success Forum fielded a national survey examining teachers' views of the value of their instructional materials for teaching multilingual learners. Some key findings from the teachers who took the survey indicate that, one, nearly 70% of teachers do not feel fully prepared to teach multilingual learners. And 64% of teachers do not regularly use the provided materials from their districts or states. So how can we give them this confidence that they can rely on their instructional materials to support our multilingual learning? In this same survey, educators did report that there being a lot of high quality standards aligned curriculum out there, which is great. And this makes sense given the strong resources and criteria for ensuring alignment to standards. However, in the same survey, only 1 in 5 teachers responded that they could rely on their materials to help tailor instruction to support our multilingual learners. And moreover, 60% reported that these materials lacked relevance for students. And 66% reported that these materials did not support them in assessing multilingual learner language. As a result, it should not be a surprise that teachers and systems continue to spend a huge amount of time and resources trying to find materials online, or they're creating them themselves, which really leads to very inconsistent results for students. The promise that we have here today is to ensure that the materials adopted in your own system can already meet the needs of multilingual learners, which will support their achievement, but also save time and money in the long run. At ELSF, we work with content developers states and districts across the country, and we're starting to see a shift in the tide in how materials are designed with language supports in mind, which is honestly very exciting. Do we still have work to do? Absolutely. But we are excited that these design shifts extend beyond having translations for materials or those sidebar boxes that recommend what to do for each proficiency level. More and more content developers, at least that we're seeing, are working towards cohesion across content areas and product lines, which is very, very exciting. So as some examples, we're moving away from prescribed supports aligned with states' proficiency levels in favor of tools like look for, listen for tables that guide teachers to notice what students do in a specific activity and respond contingently. We're also ensuring that the core writing teams learn about and attend to principles of language responsive design, rather than using the old model of having core content writers finish drafts before passing on to the language folks, the language accessibility editors. And they really had little to no authority to revise the core content. And we're moving from add-ons. You see those, add-ons that we are typically, I know when I was teaching, those call-out boxes that are just there, that often teachers ignored, to more integrated support across the curriculum. And on that note, I am going to pass it to my colleague, Jack.
Hi, I'm Jack Dieckmann, and I'm the Senior Advisor for Mathematics at the English Learner Success Forum. And as Krista just gave the general overview of the work that ELSF does, I'm going to try to provide some examples in the particular work, in the specific work that we do in mathematics. We have on the slide some of the key research that we draw from, and in particular that of Judith Moskovich, who really was the trailblazer in our field for English learners and the role of mathematics. Next slide. As a field, if we think about how far we've come, for some of you that remember the NCTM math standards back in the 80s, there was already a huge focus on reasoning and communication and representation. And ever since then, communication has been a part of the consciousness in math education, understanding the value of talk. And so we see that played out in a lot of cutting-edge, high-quality curriculum where there are rich prompts, rich discussion prompts, interesting tasks for students to think about and talk about. But what we are, in addition to the focus on language, we have things like growth mindset, academic identity. So ever more in math education, we have a more expansive view of the whole child in math learning. But one thing that we still need is, it's not enough just to elicit language. It's not enough just to ask an interesting question. We also have to help students answer that interesting question and know what it means to participate in rich discourse. And that will benefit all students. So we think of this as kind of the metaphor of a ramp. If we look on the next slide, think of this as a ramp. We have multilingual learners who have a rich linguistic repertoire, both in their everyday language, in their home language, the language of their community, the language practices that they all bring. They have cultural assets, lived experiences, and so forth. All of this richness. But what we're seeing is the need both in instruction and in instruction materials is to create that on-ramp. How do we leverage those ideas and those resources so that they can reach that which is at the top, which is participating in rich discourse? And I'll say that when I say discourse, what we refer to is not just oral discourse in the classroom, but also written. Okay, so our goal is to help build that ramp in materials especially. So we've developed a series of tools at ELSF, one of which is really for mass consumption for all people. We have other tools that are more technical and developers use them and so forth, but this is a tool that's really meant for the lay person, for the lay educator. And we call this benchmarks of quality. And there we've laid out, through consultation with experts in the field in language and mathematics, sort of the 5 top big design features that high quality instructional materials should have. And on the next slide, I'm going to review what they are. because this is going to serve as the basis for what we do. So we have these critical features, these design features. The first one is that language and content are integrated. It's not first you do language and then you do content, or vice versa. They both co-constitute each other, and they both develop at the same time. We can't separate them. Scaffolding for language learners, we know that that's important. And a lot of attention is already spent on the kinds of scaffolds that we need. The MLRs, for example, the math language routines that you may be familiar with, that's an example of a scaffold. Having students become metalinguistic, metacognitive and metalinguistic, in other words, thinking about their own language and thinking about how language works is another feature. Assets and strengths-based learning, which, as I said, using all the resources and talents and interests that students have as a way to engage them in the content. And then finally, the assessment of content and language. So we often do formative assessment of content, but not formative assessment of language. And I think here is the trailblazing work that ELSF is contributing to the field. So if you look at these as sort of bookends, the top end is the top end is the language focus, the language goal. That's the first one. And then the last one is the formative assessment of that language goal. So that sandwich of the first one is what's the language goal, where are we headed? And then the last one is how do we know that we're getting there? Those two are going to be the focus of our next slide. So when we think about language in mathematics or language for mathematical purposes, we know kind of the biggies: conjecture, explain, justify, represent, generalize, and prove. I mean, there's a set that we often see in the literature. And yet, even though these are highly valued mathematical practices, no one would argue that these aren't important. But when we look at materials and we look at instruction, we find very little in terms of that ramp. How do we learn to generalize, for example? What does generalization sound like, and where do we start, and how do we know that kids are improving along that practice of generalization? So for the next slide, we have an example of taking that idea of generalization, just that one language practice, and decomposing it into kind of a ramp. So we have a series of lessons here. And just for the purposes of display and for the purposes of emphasis, I've taken out, I pulled out what we call language goals or language objectives from each of these 5 lessons, so that we could see across how does generalization develop, not only as a mathematical practice, but as a linguistic practice. So for example, in the first lesson, students would look at a pattern and describe something that's common to the pattern. What's the same? In the second lesson, they would extend their reasoning to not only the cases that were given, but beyond the cases that were given. So how do we stretch out? So if we're doing case 1 through 5, what might case 10 look like? What might case 20 look like? So we're extending it beyond. In the next lesson, students would be given an opportunity to actually form the generalization, to formulate it, and they could do it through words, they could use symbols, equations, and so forth, depending on their level with an experience with mathematics. Following that, now they have their generalization. In lesson 4, now comes the part of justifying. How do they, through what reasoning do they feel that generalization is correct? Could they test it? Is there a series of test or counterexamples that they could use? And then finally, in the last lesson, in the sort of the culminating lesson, not only will they have had a chance to create their own generalization, but now they're critiquing the generalization and testing those and see if they can see how valid the generalization, other generalizations are. So if you notice here, this is a cognitive flow, which is based in the research, but it's also a linguistic flow. And this is what we're trying to promote, this idea that for every cognitive mathematical action that students are doing um, cognitively, there's also a linguistic, and that's linguistic meaning what we say and what we write. There's also a linguistic part that's often either ignored or implicit. And what we're trying to do is surface that and bring it more to the foreground. Okay. Next slide. So these would be language goals. So if you notice, these would be language objectives that I just reviewed. But the second part of that is also um, so for the language objectives is what does it sound like initially? Where do kids start with these words? In their own home language, in their everyday speak? How does it sound like? And this is those listen fors that Crystal alluded to, is we're putting now and recommending that we put in materials, things that teachers can listen for to hear if kids are on track. And now once we know that where kids are, how do we expect them to advance? So for the formative assessment, we know in content is a very rich area. Teachers collect work samples, they analyze them together, they look at learning trajectories. So there's a whole rich history and historical literature on formative assessment of content, but not so much of formative assessment of language of content. In other words, the disciplinary language that students are using as they work with those concepts. And so that formative assessment of language really asks the question to the teacher and to the materials developer is, how would we know that students are improving in justification? How do we know that they're getting better at generalization? What evidence could we collect? And so along the way, we would suggest to teachers in materials where they could collect language scoops, language samples from their students and collect those over time and then look at growth over time, what that might look like. And this would provide evidence to the student, evidence to the teacher, and of course, other stakeholders, parents and so forth, caregivers, that their students are improving. So that question of how we make progress is a real important one. We go to the next slide. And I think there may be something else. Great. So one way we could do it is these check for understandings. So in a unit, we might have this check for understandings where there may be an exit ticket, and we can ask students to explain how you tested that other cases, that your generalization works with other cases. So that might be an exit ticket that teachers use. Okay. Another way might be a collaborative poster. So these are features we already use in mathematics. We all do posters, exit tickets, but what I'm highlighting here is the language dimension that teachers would be especially looking for, not just our students understanding the content, but what language are they using to work with the content. So in that poster, we might ask them to represent the pattern, to talk about the additional cases that they've used, what is the generalization that they propose, and then of course be prepared to explain it to the class. So there's an oral presentation, there's an oral argument, and presumably some back and forth, some interaction. Students might have questions and they have to, the group presenting would have to answer those questions. So that's all negotiating mathematical meaning. A third example might be from one of those language routines that I told you about, one of which is compare and critique methods. So here they might be given a justification. It could be one that surfaced from the class or one that is mocked up by the teacher. So students are given one, and then as a class together, the question might be, are we convinced or not? What would make it convincing? What would make these improvements? And so for those, we want to be sure that students are also having a chance to argue and wrestle with ideas as they represent. And then finally, there's a culminating writing activity where at the end of the unit, now that students have had all this experience and feedback with their language of generalization, now they're ready to present an argument or to critique one in an extended and elaborated form. So you see across these are multiple opportunities to gather language samples with the idea of mathematical generalization.
All right, thank you, Jack. That was great. I think one of the things we wanted to highlight in our presentation today is very practically how this information and the great knowledge that Jack has imparted on us with the innovation of what we're doing at ELSF, but also some of these key tenets of research, how are they being reflected in what schools and districts are doing across the country? So we wanted to highlight a district in California, and you'll see some of their stats here on the slide. San Leandro wanted new high school math materials, and they knew it was crucial for these materials to address the needs of multilingual learners. And they were waiting for general instructional guidance from the California Mathematics Framework, which at the time, this was back in 2021, 2022, that was in limbo for getting adopted. Right now, it's finally adopted. Districts have some direction to go off of, but at the time, San Leandro couldn't wait. They needed math materials then, and they wanted to put an inclusive materials review process in place for their high school math curriculum. They wanted to understand how to identify and prioritize high quality instructional materials that truly support multilingual learners in mathematical language. So you see here from their district goals, really about improving math performance was one of their goals for all students, but in particular for multilingual learners. And go through their process. They had a couple of other goals related to this, but really getting into selection criteria. They wanted to have that for their teachers. This process involved teachers, and they wanted to ensure that it aligned with the California Math Framework, as I shared, and also some of the benchmarks of quality that we talked about in today's presentation. So what did that materials review process look like? It was really around the district leadership in San Leandro, really prioritizing this and really wanting to design an inclusive process that was not only about them, but would involve teachers. They wanted department leads involved and district staff coming together over multiple phases over 3 years. They wanted this to be something that everyone had their hands on. And the process would provide the opportunity for different district stakeholders to come together to learn about what effective materials look like for multilingual learners. They let them try out the materials, wrestle with them a bit, see what they would highlight to make a recommendation on their preferred curriculum. And then ultimately plan for implementation and PD with teachers and what that would look like with the curriculum that they selected. So here you'll see a couple of the findings. And I just want to highlight, I think, which is exciting, many districts, and I would even say states, are doing the work. They are doing the hard work to prioritize multilingual learner students. These are not things that you can add into criteria and say, this is what we need, we're going to add these on. This takes a lot of work and a lot of engagement to get everyone on the same page. And by digging deeper into the concepts through their own process, they owned the criteria that determined what was best for their students in San Leandro and ensured that the materials they selected reflected language supports critical to mathematics. So this is exciting work that is happening in one district in California. They are ahead of the game in terms of identifying math materials that are really inclusive of multilingual learners and prioritize language. And we're excited about the continued work that is happening across the country with this exciting innovation. And when we talked about the mathematics benchmarks of quality today, these again are freely available and they're most useful for education leaders and decision makers. But there is also content-specific guidance for those that may be on this webinar that might be developing curricular materials. And we wanted to highlight those as well as another free resource. Again, these are all research-based resources that we want everyone to have access to understand how to concretely integrate the concepts that Jack was talking about today. And these here provide much more detailed guidance and examples of how language support shows up in instruction.
The focus of this conference has been on secondary mathematics. And we know that that's a crucial period in students' life trajectories. So high school is where students decide whether they're going to go to college, what they're going to pursue in terms of work and career. So we want to be sure that we get the mathematics right, that they have a strong foundation in mathematics that opens up a wide array of decisions for them and possibilities for them. And included are their English learners and multilingual learners. Second, we want to be sure that whatever recommendation we make, whatever scaffold, whatever support, we want it to be based in the discipline of mathematics, that it meets the intent and rigorous nature of the mathematics we want all students to know.
And also, I think one of the other takeaways here is that, I talked a little bit at the beginning that, exciting progress that has been made in the field. But there needs to be more work. And I think one of these is that states and districts are in need. They're asking for better instructional materials with explicit language supports, reflecting some of the things that we talked about today, because they know how important it is for their multilingual learners, but that it also benefits every other student in that classroom. So they are in need. We are moving in this direction, and I think that's really exciting to see some of these, some of the progress that's been being made here. And then lastly, I'll just also say a big takeaway. I know there's lots of things we can do to amplify language in our instruction, and that is key for teachers to understand what this looks like. But we want to also emphasize that quality mathematics materials are also a lever for equitable learning. If it's there, teachers will use it, right? If it's not there, they are going to go to their own searches. We know Google and Pinterest are still the highest form of resources for many of our teachers because they don't have what they need. So I just want to, highlight that with today of like, that is a big takeaway for us. And I hope for you in listening to this, that we are moving in that direction, and we've got a lot of work to do, but it is a tremendous lever for equity if we really do want the equitable outcomes for our multilingual learners. And on that note, we'll end by saying thank you for joining us today. Really appreciate your attending and listening to what we had to say. If you need to get in touch, here's my contact information. And we encourage you to visit our website, where we have lots of free materials that we want folks to know how to actually actualize all of the things that we talked about today. So thank you, and have a great day.
Thank you.
We got one question, Jack.
Okay.
It was talked about, the focus of this presentation was on multilingual learners throughout the presentation. But what impact do these design features have on other students? So can we apply some of these learnings to a general ed mathematics classroom?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a very, very great question. And it's really in sync with where the latest thinking is now, because older thinking used to be like, you do something for your Gen Pop kids, and then you do something else for your English learners. But we know now that everyone is a student of the language of mathematics, the disciplinary language of mathematics. Everyone is learning. If you're English only, you are also learning mathematics. So there's a commonality that these structures that we're proposing and these design features, they benefit everybody, but they are lifesavers in terms of succeeding in the classroom for students who are in the process of learning new content and learning another language. That double cognitive load that they're bearing, these supports are super essential. So it benefits everybody, essential for multilingual learners.
Awesome. I think to extend on that too, I think that's the, as we shared in the presentation, right? That is also what states and districts are now asking for. So going through this process, hearing from teachers saying, well, what does this mean for not only our multilingual learners, but also maybe students behind grade level, and so these practical, design features and what we hope to see in materials moving forward is going to be one way to address that.
There's another idea that comes up a lot when we engage participants in this kind of discussion is that content developers had this idea or had a practice of usually developing all of the content sequence, like all of the material for the content, and then going back and saying, okay, what can we add for English language learners? How do we provide more support? But so that rather than doing that design as an afterwards, others are doing it early on, thinking about language development and language variability as a design feature from the beginning. In other words, baking it into the DNA rather than trying to, add it later.
Mm-hmm. I'll ask you a question, Jack, just because you've been in the field of mathematics for some time and have likely seen the changes. The title of this session is really Amplifying Language in Secondary Mathematics. How much of this is new? I would say in the past years that you've been at this, and how much of this is something that is just integrating what we've known into materials, into our approach. But just your perspective over the last couple of years and being in this field, what changes have you seen in the field of mathematics, especially for secondary? That's a big question.
I mean, I think one of the distinctions is in elementary teachers tend to have a more comprehensive view of language because they may also teach reading and English language arts. So they already have a sense of how language works across different subjects. But mathematics teachers at the secondary level are often specialists. And for many of us, and I include myself in that category, language it's kind of invisible. It's like we think about the ideas in the head and whether they can understand the concepts, conceptual learning, but not necessarily language development. And so I think there's a greater awareness now with the spread of the mathematical language routines, for example, in several huge curricula. You see more attention to the explicit instruction and explicit attention to how the language of mathematics actually develops. And some of the codes that are kind of like hard to break, for example, mathematics has a lot of syntax. We say things and do things and write things in a very particular way, but we're not often extremely explicit about that. So for many students, especially multilingual learners, it's like an unbreakable code. But there's greater awareness now to bring that code and to kind of break that code to make it more accessible.
That's great. I want to welcome, we know we have a few people here with us today live. And so if you don't mind adding any questions that you have for Jack or myself in the Q&A, that'd be great.
Maybe we could also mention kind of a special strong emphasis of multilingual learners in the California framework. I think that's a very big groundbreaking document that is really, really not just, as a section in equity, it's embedded throughout many sections of that document. And so that gives us a lot of hope that people who do materials and teacher guidance and so forth, professional development, that they're going to have that also that at the forefront.
Yeah, that's really exciting. I think in our work in California, obviously, is like, we know that over a quarter of students in the state of California are as our colleagues say, bureaucratically categorized as English learners. And so what does that look for? We have some strong frameworks, I think, in California with ELA, ELD framework, and really guiding that. But now with mathematics, really amplifying language throughout the entire framework is really exciting. And I think, I know we've done some work on the ground about, I think the last time California had an adoption for math materials was back in 2012. So we're talking about a decade ago, and how all of this new, I would even say just research and what we know has been part of this, is that's now being part of the development of materials. And the framework does a really great job, I think, of highlighting what that looks like. And then also showcasing how it's critical for not only multilingual learners, but everybody else in California. Great, we got some great comments. Thank you, Jason and Vinci. So we got a question. It says, you mentioned the importance of having structured and explicit language supports integrated into mathematics coursework and units. Are there any available exemplars or examples of SEA LEAs that are doing this very well? So I would point you to our website. We have a couple of case studies of some districts and some states that are being very explicit with these supports and what does that look like. I think in terms of exemplar lessons, Jack, do we have a few exemplar lessons as well, I think, listed out on our website?
We do, yes.
So, yeah. I think when we mentioned San Leandro, I think we've got a couple of other places, that we highlight on the site, that if you want to see what does it look like from a state perspective, because that is a big one. But yes, we do have some of those available. And I think they may be in our the toolbox or whatever it is that we have on our link to this presentation.
And there's other state frameworks that have also put multilingual learners front and center. Rhode Island, Delaware, where it's really, really clear that there's a commitment at every level of the system. And so teachers getting together, sharing ideas, knowing what to look for when you're adopting materials. So.
Absolutely. It looks like we got about 1 minute left, Jack. Any last words for our folks that are with us today? Thank you for joining us.
Exactly. Thank you. I would just say that this is a very big task, and it takes a lot of good minds to figure this out, working together across multiple sectors. And ELSF is really a forum for all kinds of stakeholders to come together to do this. So I hope that there's a chance, if this is a point of interest for you, to figure out what is your piece of the puzzle in this endeavor. And we'd love to collaborate with you. Enjoy the rest of the conference.
Yes. Thank you, everyone.